Welcome to the Brown Initiative for Discipleship and Evangelism. My name is Ethan Brown, and this is BIDE. I'm producing this video in part because I am a partnership student at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where I am studying in the Doctor of Ministry program, where I'm studying outreach and discipleship. If you'd like to learn more about the partnership program, or if you'd like to join with me either as a part of my prayer team or as someone who's giving me financial support, I'll leave more about that program information for you in the description below. Also, if BIDE is useful to you, if you're being blessed by this podcast, please feel free to share this video with someone you think also might be blessed by it. I'm out here for a walk today instead of sitting on my front porch because I want to take a journey through the scriptures. I thought it might be good to represent that physically by walking about as we walk through the story of the Bible. The Bible is a huge, epic story. And in my last episode, I talked about a couple of kind of disappointing things that I've encountered in church life. I gave you two examples of people who kind of downplayed the Old Testament narrative. It's big, it's difficult, and it's not maybe for the uninitiated. Okay, I can actually say, yeah, it is a very long story. And it's not easy necessarily to get our head around. But that doesn't mean it's not worth the hard work that is necessary to get a good grasp on this story. One of the things that the apostles do is they show us that the Bible can be read messianically, through the theme of the Messiah, through the understanding that the whole Old Testament story is really meant to tell us one story, and that story is the story of Jesus. Now, obviously, if you read through the Old Testament, it's not the story of Jesus in the same way that the Gospels are. The Gospels have his name in it. Every story is a story about Jesus, literally, in the Gospels. But if you know how to read this story, you know that the whole thing is focused in on just one truth: that God intends for a human king to reign over his creation. And that no matter what happens that might attempt to frustrate that, ultimately, God's going to see to it that royal nature of our creation, that the intent that God has when he made us is going to be reestablished. And the whole Old Testament story is a story of how that happens through the coming Messiah. Now, of course, we don't get to the Messiah until the New Covenant. But the whole Old Testament can be read in such a way that the whole focus is on that great coming king, the rescuer king who sets things right and reestablishes the divine order. To see the story that way, we're going to start with creation itself. When God makes the world, it's a well-known fact that everything that he makes, he announces, okay, that's good, that's good, that's good. I'm doing well here. He says that about each of the things that he makes. But when it comes time to create humanity, it's the first time that before he does the creative act, he spends just a moment to think about what he's about to do. Before God creates human beings, the first thing he does is say, let's create man in our own image. And then he says, Let's give him dominion. Dominion is a word to describe the behavior of a king. Or a queen. You know, if you're a woman, then if you have dominion, that means you're a queen. So when God created humanity, he had the intention that humanity would bear his image, fill up the earth with his image, but also reign over his creation. Everything that he was going to make, every living creature, was to look at human beings as their kings and their queens. Now, it's not very long into the story before the wheels come off for that. We don't see human beings reigning over creation as we go through the story. Mostly what we see them reigning over is each other, and usually in not real nice ways. It's because by chapter 3, an enemy shows up that deceives us and distorts us, pulling us away from that God-intended creation purpose. Rather than living as creatures with the responsibility of reigning over the world, we became creatures who thought it was our responsibility to seek fulfillment, to seek pleasure, to seek our desires being met, doing it all for ourselves, trying to be something that we were already given. Eve saw that the fruit was good and that it could make you wise and that it could make you like God. Well, she's already like God. But that deception broke our race. And in a very real way, we surrendered the right to reign in God's created order. It's a heartbreaking story. You know, that story, all of that, is very familiar ground to most Christians. It's because it sets up our anthropology. It explains why we behave badly, why we have a problem that needs to be resolved, why we're separated from God. We know that story very well. But if you take the advice of the Christians that I mentioned in my last episode, we're going to skip over 926 chapters of the Bible and treat them as relatively irrelevant. The story that comes next, well, that doesn't really matter. What really matters is that we get to a Savior who can resolve this problem of sin. We don't generally couch the problem of sin as the surrendering of our royal nature or the collapse of our divine image-bearing purposes. We don't usually see it that way. We see it as something that makes me feel very naughty and I need to be cleansed from, a problem that will kill me and separate me from God forever. That's how we generally pitch it. And then Jesus becomes the sacrifice that resolves that problem. But is that the story those 926 intervening chapters is trying to set up? Is that the right way to understand what Matthew is trying to tell us, or Mark, or Luke, or John? Is it how Paul understood things? Is it the message that we have inherited to give to the world? I'm going to suggest, yeah, probably not. What I'm going to take you through in the next several minutes is a look at a read of the story that focuses in on hinge points that reveal the Messiah. Moments where God does something that moves the story forward by letting us know just a little bit more about Messiah. It actually begins right there in chapter 3 of the whole Bible when God is pronouncing consequences on his creation. If you're going to sin like this, if you're going to break covenant with me, well, then the world you're going to live in isn't going to function the way that it should. And so God places curse on the earth. He doesn't actually curse humanity. He announces consequence to humanity. But to his creation, he says, no, it's not going to be like it was. Thorn and thistle is what it's going to bring forward. You're going to have to work hard. You're going to sweat. Even reproduction isn't going to be what it's supposed to be, the beautiful, glorious thing that it still is, but it's going to be loaded with pain and suffering, the raising of kids and marriage. It's all going to be messed up. Why? Well, because we're broken. We are messed up. But God begins by saying to the deceiver, the one who fooled us, he says, okay, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head and you will bruise his heel. If a viper bites you on the heel, you die. If you crush a viper's head, it dies. So somehow, someone will be born into the human line who will undo the damage that the serpent has done. And he will be doing it by overcoming death by death. That's the beginning of the story. I wish the next story was good, but from chapter 3 through chapter 11 of Genesis is all pretty hard stuff. God's first creative order work, his first work in ordering creation, is to separate waters and bring the seas away from the dry land. But what we see in Genesis is that sin is so destructive to creation that the wickedness of humanity on the earth results in uncreation. The waters that God has driven away come back. That's to let us know just how bad this problem is. It's not a trivial thing around the edges. It is a big deal. We've lost so much when we surrendered what we were for. We're meant to reign here. But we've surrendered that to that enemy prince, the prince of the power of darkness of the air. By chapter 11, the waters have receded and the destruction to creation is being undone. But all is not well. In fact, humanity that's supposed to spread out and fill the earth with God's image is instead, it's not interested in glorifying God. Humanity is interested in glorifying itself. And even though the uncreation happened, the enduring problem of sin is still around. If God's going to get his creatures back to their intended purpose, he's got a lot of work to do. That story really begins in chapter 12 with a call of a guy named Abraham. Abraham is the headwaters of it all. God will come and say, hey, come with me. And this 75-year-old man will do what no one in the ancient world does. Leave home. Everybody sticks together. It's the only place of safety in a world that's filled with dangerous humans. But Abraham, he hears this voice calling him and says, all right, I'll come with you. It's not surprising when you think about it. He's 75 years old and he has no kids. That's a sad story in our world. But in the ancient world, that's a cursed person. The way that you honor your family is to continue the family line. And if you don't do that, you kill your family off. So this old man, this old broken-hearted man, has lived 75 years with no children. He's lived 75 years as a curse. That's who God chooses to begin his redemptive work with. He says, come with me and I'll bless you. I'll make you to be a blessing. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. And in you, all of the families of the earth shall secure for themselves a blessing. Somehow, this childless man's offspring were to become the people who bless all the world. This is God's beginning of the restoration of humanity. Now, what happens in the rest of the Bible is the story of that man's family and the keeping of that promise. How does that man's family become a blessing to all the families? Well, to do that, he's got to have a family. So at the age of 100, he finally does. He has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob. Jacob, the liar, the deceiver, the trickster. And Jacob has 12 kids. And I told you I'm going to focus here not on the stories of these individual people, but on the story of how God built the expectations of the Messiah. First one is in Genesis 3, the second one in Genesis 12 and maybe 15. The third one comes much later when Jacob is blessing his children. Jacob blesses all of them, but the big promise doesn't come to the firstborn or to the secondborn or the third. In the ancient world, you bless them in order of their arrival in the world. They're more important the earlier they came. But not with God. God defies all human expectations. And it's the fourth kid that gets the really big blessing. And what is that? It's the blessing of dominion, of reigning, that the scepter won't depart from Judah. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, he's going to reign. That's a really big deal. When you think about God's created purposes, he's saying, okay, this reigning is going to happen through Judah. And what we're going to see in the rest of the story as it unfolds, all of the tribes will be important. But it's Judah's tribe where the great king will come. Things roll forward. The story happens in such a way that Joseph, one of the kids, had ended up in Egypt ahead of them, and he saves the whole family. He leads them into Egypt, a place where there's food, so that famine can't kill this family off before the world can be blessed by them. Now, in Egypt, the story, as we get to the end of Genesis, this story is one that's filled with honor and power, but as the next book of the Bible opens up, everything is shifted. We see what human beings do with what power they have. The dominion that they have isn't like God's dominion to lift things up, to pay attention to the needs of what it is you're reigning over, and to bless those things. That's not what human beings do. In Egypt, we see just how powerful sin can be as human beings own each other and oppress each other. That has to be part of our story. We have to learn just how deep our problem goes, because we were made to have dominion, but not like this. So in Egypt, the people are oppressed and they cry out to God. God sends them a deliverer who rescues them. And he does it with his mighty outstretched arm. He sends the plagues against Egypt. He leads them out after the Passover. And of course, the Passover story, you wouldn't see that as Messianic until the Messiah picks up the Passover story in the Gospels. When Jesus wants to define his death, he doesn't arrange to die at the Day of Atonement, where it would be interpreted almost immediately as the redemption of the people, the forgiveness of sins, and the restoration of right relationship with God. He doesn't do it then. He cleanses the temple and so enrages the leadership of Israel against him that they're going to kill him at Passover. Because Jesus wants his death to be understood as the death of the Passover lamb, the sacrifice that rescues people from slavery, and more than that, from being taskmasters against each other, from oppressing each other. We wouldn't see it as one of the hinge points toward the Messiah until we see the Messiah. And once we've seen the Messiah, we know that it is. But there are a few points in the work of Moses where you get particular important hinge points about the Messiah, a few of the laws that God gave. And I'm sure there's a bunch. I'm just going to give a few. One of them comes in Deuteronomy chapter 17, where beginning in verse 14, Moses will focus in on the nature of a king. And what is a king supposed to be like? Well, everybody knows what a king is like. Kings reign. Kings are in charge. Kings have power and authority. Kings have armies. Kings are generally pretty rich. They got a lot of money. And they do it by taxing people. So they take our money. And kings go to war. Kings take prisoners of war and make them into slaves. Kings that aren't strong enough to win in wars, they involve themselves in treaties with other nations. They're filled with intrigue. Everyone knows what a king is. But not everyone knows what God's king is supposed to be like. Because it's none of that. In Deuteronomy 17, in fact, God through Moses, rules out all of those human ways. He's not supposed to acquire a lot of gold, a lot of horses and chariots. He's not to get involved in a lot of political marriages. That's not who the king is supposed to be. Instead, the king is supposed to make a handwritten copy of the law and then rule from that all of his life. He's supposed to make his own copy by his own hand so that he will know the will of God with a kind of profound intimacy. And then from that, he's supposed to lead other people to live their lives lined up with that. That is a hinge point. Another one is where God promises to send a prophet like Moses. He says, I'm going to send one. Moses, announcing God's prophecy, says, a prophet like me will arise from among your brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth. And you got to listen to him. And anybody who doesn't is going to be cut off from the people. That person never shows up in the Old Testament narrative. There is no other prophet like Moses. There are lots of prophets that do lots of impressive things. But not like Moses did. Moses isn't just one who speaks for God. Moses is one who delivers for God. He's God's instrument of deliverance for the people. Not only that, but he's also the covenant maker. He's one who establishes covenant for God. So God has set up this expectation of kings and prophets, and they're coming, but they never show up. I'll throw one more at you. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, God manages to sneak in a little way for someone to bear the curse for everybody else. Anybody who's hung on a tree, God says, is under the curse. You got to take him down. Don't leave him up on a tree. If you hang him up on a tree, a hanged man is under God's curse. Again, we wouldn't necessarily see that as messianic. We really wouldn't. Until we see the Messiah. Now, at this point in the story, I'm going to kick into summary mode a little bit because we're going to skip forward several hundred years. That's not because the stuff I'm about to skim over isn't important. It's fascinating stuff. There's good stuff to learn here, but I'm trying to focus on a messianic read of the Bible, one that takes the Messiah as the center point of all of it. So after Moses, God hands on leadership from Moses to Joshua. Joshua, whose name is Yeshua. Yeshua delivers the land into the hands of the people through terrible violence. It's actually a pretty sad story and a totally unnecessary one. God had promised in Exodus that he would send the hornet ahead of them. If they would just have listened to God, they wouldn't have had to be instruments of judgment the way that they are in the book of Joshua. The people who were living in the land ahead of them would have been driven out little by God himself, and there wouldn't have been any violence against them. If God wanted to punish those people, he would have done it himself. But no, they have to go in and do this bloody act of conquest because they rejected God's plan A. They did that in the book of Numbers. They wandered around in the desert for all those years. And then a new generation rose up, and it's that generation that Joshua leads into the promised land. And we see this bloody conquest as God keeps his promises through terrible bloody violence. It's a very sad story. It's the story of the fallenness of the human world. It really is. But an interesting thing is that Joshua, his name in Hebrew is Yeshua, and Jesus, the English version of our Lord's name, well, the Hebrew version of that would be Yeshua, Joshua. Fascinating truth is that God sends both Joshuas to keep his covenant promises through dreadful violence. It's just that when human beings try to get things done, there's a lot of bloodshed of other human beings. But when God works to do his redemptive work, he brings that same violence upon himself. There's several hundred years where Israel lives without a king. The best they've got are military leaders called judges, and it's very messy. But eventually they cry out to God for a king. And the fascinating thing is, they're not really looking for that divine promise of dominion. It's almost like it's just as forgotten to them as it is to so many modern readers of the Bible. It's just not important to them. What they want is a king like the nations. They want to be like everybody else. So God lets them have a king like the nations. And King Saul, that's exactly what they get. But in the high point of the Old Testament, we encounter God's king. The king who is after God's own heart, David. David's a messy guy. He really is. He is beautiful and good. He's barbaric and ugly. There's wonderful stuff in his reign for the first bit. And then we watch as he collapses and falls apart. Because while he is this good, godly man, he's a man. And he has the problems that are common to human beings. He's a broken guy. But he is the focal point of the Old Testament. Many people don't know that, but there are more stories about King David than there are about anybody else. More stories about David than Moses. Moses wrote more than David did. Well, at least I think so. I haven't counted the Psalms, but Moses wrote 5 books in the Bible. But when it comes to stories about Moses, an awful lot of that's not narrative. An awful lot of that is law. And even the narratives that are there, obviously, Moses doesn't show up in Genesis, even though he wrote that, because he wasn't born yet. So, if you count up the narratives about Moses, and you count up the narratives about David, David wins. There are more stories about him than anybody else. He's the big hero of the Old Testament text. And when it comes to human history, prior to Jesus, he's probably the most important human being. Because it's to David that God makes the promise that we would think of as the true Messianic promise. The promise that God is going to send a king. It's found in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and it's the first 17 verses of that chapter. What happens is that David is settled into his reign. He's built his own house made out of cedar. It's a nice, expensive palace, beautiful place. And he's settled in, but he realizes that God's living in a tent. He's like, that's not okay. It's not okay for me, a human being, to have a house of cedar when God doesn't. And he tells a prophet, I want to build God a house. And the prophet says, hey, that's a good plan. Go do whatever you want. But that night, God comes to that prophet and says, you go tell David I didn't ask him to do this. The whole time that I've been settled in the land, have I asked anybody to build me a house? David, you're not the right guy. There's blood on your hands. You don't get to do this. But what you go tell my servant David is this. You're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you one. And raise up from your own flesh, when you have laid down and are sleeping with your fathers, I will raise up one after you, and I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. And, there's weird language in here about him being punished with the rods of men, even when he commits iniquity. Turns out the fulfillment of that would change commits to becomes, because God made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that we might become his righteousness. But there's that language there about punishment. But the promise is, I won't take my steadfast love away from him the way I took it from Saul. And his kingdom and his throne will be established before me forever. So what we have is God making a promise to David that someone is going to come along in David's line, a king who will reign after David's line, and he will reign forever. Now, here's the thing about that. Kings that try to reign forever tend to be megalomaniacs, and they also tend to not accomplish it because they die. And death presents a problem to anyone who wants to establish an eternal throne. It just can't be done. In order to do it, somehow you'd have to deal with the death problem. But that's getting ahead of the story. It is from this point on that there is reason to expect a Messiah. There have already been turning points and already been promises made where, we can expect somebody to come. God promised the serpent, there's going to be someone born into this woman's line who's going to take care of you, you rascal. And there's the promise to Abraham that somehow everybody's going to get blessed. Promise to Judah of an eternal reign, but that could just be his offspring forever. But here you've got one person in mind who is going to be an eternal king. And that's where we start looking for the Messiah. The word Messiah means anointed. There are three people in the Old Testament, three classes of people who would get anointed. Prophets would be anointed. Elijah goes and anoints Elisha to be prophet. Priests, at the beginning of their service, would receive an anointing. But ultimately, the real anointing is of kings. This is the handing on of God's approval for dominion. And here, God is making a promise that a king is coming into this great king, the main story of the Old Testament, this great king who will be established as king forever. Well, after David hears that, David, who is a songwriter, writes a lot of songs about that. I'll throw two at you. Psalm 2 and Psalm 72 are both very clearly about this promise that God made to David. It's David, singing about and reflecting on this great hope that God has given him, that he'll have offspring who will reign forever. And so you have in Psalm 2, you've got this question at the outset. Why are the nations so grumpy? They rage and they're all upset, but God laughs at them. And he says to his king, ask of me, and I will give you the nations as an inheritance. Whoa, David is doing something more than was expected. This is not just an eternal king, this is a global king. I got to tell you, Israel in the ancient world was a little postage stamp of a nation. Okay, under David, it had some power. Under Ahab, the northern tribes would actually become a mover and shaker. They were involved in a battle called Karkar, which nobody knows about because the Bible didn't mention it, but it was a big deal. It was in the ancient world, but we don't have to care about it. But frankly, in terms of a world power, God's people weren't it. They were a backwater nothing nation. They never really wielded power on the global stage. But here's David singing about that, writing a song that would become part of Israel's songbook. When they wanted to worship God, they would sing about the king that God would give the nations to. Psalm 72 talks about his reign with a focus on care for the poor. This guy's not going to be the kind of king other kings are. He's going to reign with mercy and with justice for the oppressed. He's going to make things right between oppressed and oppressor. He's going to fix all that mess. And again, global reign. He's going to reign over the whole world. That's David singing about that promise that God made. It's really no surprise then that when the first century rolls around, after 1,000 years of singing these songs by this poet king, that the people would expect someone to come who would reign over the whole world. Because by the time the first century rolled around, that clearly hadn't happened. In fact, what happened is really sad. The next big moment in the life of God's people is exile. Everything from David until that time comes is the story of a decaying kingdom. And it's really sad. David reigned over all of the people of God. So did his son, but his son's son didn't. David's grandson managed to be such a fool that he wouldn't listen to wise counsel, and he splits Israel into two nations. You have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern is the 10 tribes up there, and south is Judah, and it's really, really sad. These are people who ought to love each other. God always treats the whole group of them as though they are his people. He sends prophets to both the north and to the south. But the north never does have what God would assess as a good king. Not one time. All of them do what's called the sin of Jeroboam, which is a sin of corrupting Judaism. In fact, that version of Judaism didn't survive. It got destroyed by exile. The southern kingdom doesn't do just a whole lot better. There's 3, maybe 4 kings that are worth talking about. Hezekiah, Josiah. There are some competent kings. Uzziah is a very competent king. But no one like David ever shows up again. No one who walks after God with his whole heart, the way that David did for the first part of his reign. That sad collapse, I wish it didn't, but it's got its origin in the story of David himself. His sin with Bathsheba blows up his family. And so the family dynamics in the royal family are dynamics of corruption and decay. And you see that working out in all of his children. They all have to bear that. It's such a mess. As I said, this all leads to exile. God will allow the people to spiral down and down and down until finally he can take it no more, and he sends them off into exile. Now, it's important to note that exile is not just a spanking. Exile is an execution of a nation. The purpose of exile is to take a people group away from their homeland. And if you take people away from their homeland, you take them away from everything that is familiar. And so everything that culturally makes them who they are is lost. They lose their centers of worship, so their connection to their divinity is taken away. But they also lose things like control of what they eat. And you want to build a culture? Give them a menu. We eat hot dogs and hamburgers. Makes us American. Pizza and apple pie. We've obviously collected foods from all over the place. But what makes us American? Hamburgers and apple pie. Imagine none of that's ever available to us again. And we're eating cornmeal mush and broth for the rest of our lives. If you take them from their homeland, everyone has a connection to where they live. But exile strips you of that. So all the things that build a nation's national identity, exile destroys. So exile is about murdering a people group. That's why human beings did it. If you had a group of people that were particularly difficult to rule, well, that's pretty simple. Just pull these people up, put fish hooks through their skin, and pull them away from there. Put them over here. Take the people who are over here, throw them over there. Take the people who are over there, throw them down here. That's how you do this. And eventually, their broken will allow them to syncretize into the other nations around them. Well, the 10 tribes are carried off into exile in 2 Kings chapter 17. It's a dreadful story. It really is. It's awful as the people are pulled away. And as I said, that version of Judaism, it went with them. Modern Judaism doesn't have any relationship at all with the northern 10 tribes. Their calendar was different. Their priesthood was different. Their places of worship were different. Everything that really made a religion, Jeroboam changed it all. God destroyed it. But then, about not quite 10 chapters later, what happened to the north? It also comes to David's family. The kingship of David's people lasted so long. But eventually, it comes to a close as well. They also are led off into exile in Babylon. But some amazing things have happened slightly before exile and during exile and even after exile that make this story a little different. God sent prophets, people to go and preach and announce to the world what it was he was doing. The first and biggest, the greatest theologian of the whole thing, the whole show, is a guy named Isaiah. Isaiah is born between two cataclysms. In the one, the northern 10 tribes briefly took over Judah. A woman named Athaliah came and slaughtered, or so she thought, everyone in David's family. God managed to keep one little baby alive. And for 7 years, Athaliah and her family reigned in Judah. It's a time of terrible turmoil. But eventually, that little baby grew old enough that regents could rule through him, and he was put back on the throne. Athaliah wiped out. That's one cataclysm. The other one is exile. The people of God, when Isaiah comes, are people wrestling with what almost happened. It's been 100 years since that whole Athaliah stuff happened, but it's big deal to their national identity. After all, God had promised always be a king on the throne from David's family. Was that promise going to be kept? Could God be counted on? And now, afterwards, in these shaky times, the faith of the kings in David's family are just not as deep or strong as David's. So God sends a prophet with faith that's every bit as deep as David's, and that's Isaiah. Isaiah tells us more about Messiah than any one individual in the rest of the Bible, probably the rest of them combined. God shows Isaiah this wondrous picture of an eternal king. Like in chapter 9, where God says to the people through Isaiah, "To us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." That's Messiah. Or in chapter 11, where you have this wonderful king who will reign by the Spirit that he wears like a belt around him, Spirit of justice and mercy, and he cares for the poor, and his reign redoes creation so that wolf and sheep can lay down together, and a baby can be right over the nest of the asp without danger. It's a beautiful picture. This wonderful picture of coming Messiah. Or one of my absolute favorites, in chapter 16, the Messiah will spread his tent over the refugees of Moab. Now, if you know Moab is a great enemy of God's people, but they're refugees. They're in danger. And the character of the Messiah is going to be such that the terrible enemies of God are going to be protected and brought into his shade. What a great guy. This Messiah person's going to be amazing. And of course, the songs, the servant songs toward the end of Isaiah are just stunningly beautiful. There's 4 of those. I'll put those on the screen right now. But they're the picture of a very different kind of ruler. One who doesn't snuff out the smoldering wick. The irritating life whose smoke gets in your eyes. And he cares about that person. Or the one who doesn't turn his cheek away from people who pull out the beard. The one who doesn't shout in anger against injustice. Like everybody does. No, he's going to be very different. He will be the one at whom kings shut their mouths, cover their mouths, because he will sprinkle many nations. And he'll be very unattractive, unappealing. He won't grow up among us with beauty and splendor. Exile will see to that. His family will be stripped of all those things. But instead, as one from whom men hide their faces, and God will lay upon him the iniquity of us all. The thing about the servant songs is that, again, until you see the Messiah do his thing, you might not know that he's the Messiah. In fact, Judaism expected multiple Messiahs. One who would be royal, Davidic, who would come and reign. He'd be a military leader. He'd cast out the enemies. He'd reign over us. And one who would come to suffer for us, the suffering servant. Thought they were different people. Turned out it was Jesus all along. But Isaiah is the greatest of the prophets who prepares the people for exile. He lets them know that the nations are stronger and punishment is coming. But God will bring us home. So don't lose your identity when you go into exile. 100 years from now, he didn't ever say that, but that's what it turned out to be. When you go into exile, remember who you are. Hang on to your God while you're there. Stay with him. Jeremiah would come as the people were going into exile. Everything's falling apart when Jeremiah's around. And it's through Jeremiah that God promises, I'm going to make a new covenant with you. And it won't be like the covenant I made with your fathers. Covenant that they broke, even though I was so good to them. But it won't be like that. But I'm going to put my spirit in you. Everybody's going to know me. No one's going to say, know the Lord. Because from the least to the greatest, they're all going to know me. Years later, Ezekiel would serve God. Ezekiel's a hilarious guy. Ezekiel, he was 25 years old when the exile happened. When he got carried away from what he'd been hoping his whole life. See, he was a priest. And at age 25 is when you would start serving the Lord in the temple. So, he was looking forward to this, training for it his whole life. And now here he is in Babylon, where he's not going to get to do any of that. He, in the early chapters of his book, you can almost sense his grumpiness on the page. He is a sad, grumpy man. But to him, God will say, no, you're going to be my person. and he even forces him to be silent. He won't let him talk for like a year. He forces him to lay on one side for almost half a year, and then on the other side for almost half a year, a little longer actually. And it's all to show how long the exile is going to be. It's a mess. He tells him, cook your food over your own poop. And Ezekiel's like, oh, come on. And so God is like, okay, you can use cow dung instead. But he lays down for a year. Can you imagine having that on your resume? What'd you do last year? Well, I laid around. But it's to this guy that God says, it's not for your sake, Israel, that I'm about to act. No, it's not for you. But for the sake of my holy name that you've profaned among the nations. But I'm about to do something amazing. I'm going to wash you with clean water, and I'm going to cleanse you from all your iniquities. And I'm going to take out your heart of stone, and I'm going to replace it with a heart of flesh. And I will cause you to walk in my ways and keep my commandments, says the Lord. It's amazing promises. And once again, you might not immediately recognize that as the work of the Messiah, except that he mentions my shepherd David in connection with it. But once you know what Messiah Jesus did, once you know about the outpoured Spirit, it's very obvious what Ezekiel's talking about. Also, in exile, you get the answer of how can an exiled people retain their identity? That's a hard question. God sees to it through Daniel, because if you just have a few things to hang on to that will make you who you are, then you can do that. Things like food, which is why it's so important in the early chapters of Daniel, that Daniel says to the people who are master over he and his friends, look, we can't eat this food. Just give us vegetables. Why? Because they want to eat kosher. The food they're being given isn't kosher food. So he says, just let us eat kosher. He lets them do it, and God blesses them and makes them healthy. Daniel's also the one who's caught praying on Sabbath. The few things that you can do while in exile, to maintain your identity. That's Daniel. But far more important is the Son of Man. Daniel has a vision of these monsters that represent the kingdoms of the world that are coming as the future unfolds from Daniel's perspective. We can look back and we can see that that's very accurate foretelling of the future in front of them. But Daniel says he sees all these monsters, a horn that calls out these blasphemous names, and it's just awful stuff. Meanwhile, in the heavens, there is the Ancient of Days, the one who has splendor and sits on a throne, and that's God. And then appearing before him is one like a son of man, and to him was given dominion and authority and a kingdom, and his kingdom will never pass away. There's hope for the Messiah, even in exile. And those promises come while the people are suffering, while the stuff's being done to them that's supposed to destroy their identity. The hope of a brand new identity is being given. See, God keeps them who they are. Why? Because he promised a Messiah to David. Now, all the promises that he's made up to this point, he's got to keep them all. So in Daniel, we hear this message, hang on, I'm not done with you yet. And sure enough, they come home. Nehemiah learns about the terrible state of Jerusalem. He weeps and he prays a prayer of repentance, calling out to God, please, restore us, please. And he goes back to rebuild. Ezra the priest also goes back to rebuild, and they rebuild the temple. But once the foundations are laid, and what they're going to make has become clear, there are people who cry out, they shout for joy. But the old men who had seen the first temple, they didn't do that. They weep. They cry about it. And there's a prophet later who will tell this same story and say, look at this. Look at this temple that we're building. Does it seem like nothing to you? But just wait. The glory's coming. And that's how the story ends. You wouldn't expect that, because there have been so many promises, haven't there? So much has been set up. We've got so much to expect, so much to hope for, but we don't have fulfillment of any of it. Who's the person who's going to come into Eve's family to undo the work of the serpent and the destructive stuff that's been done to us? Who is that? In the Old Testament, I don't see them. By the end of the story, Abraham's family has enmity with everybody around him. And everybody around them has enmity with them. I mean, isn't it still true to this very day? Is there a people hated like the Jews? Oh, it's heartbreaking. The anti-Semitism is disgusting in this world. And so much of it has been done by Christians. That doesn't break your heart. You need to think more deeply about it. But how is this group of people going to be a blessing to all the families of the world? At the end of the story, that just doesn't seem very likely. Where is there a king who kept the law of Moses and didn't get lots of military power or wealth? Or not even David, who was really the best king you ever run into. Not even David did that. Where's the prophet like Moses, who will have the word of God in his mouth? I don't see him, do you? Where is the one who will sit on the eternal throne? None of David's offspring qualify. It's enough to break your heart watching the sad decay of David's family. Where is the one who's going to rule over all of the nations that David sang about? I don't see him. Do you? Where's the one who will judge with equity for the poor? I just don't see that guy. I want to see that guy. I don't see that guy. Where's the wonderful counselor? The one that you could look at and say, mighty God works through him. Where's the new covenant maker? Where's the Son of Man? Where's the hope? We were promised all of these things, but by the end of the story, all these threads just sit there. All of them do. None of them are fulfilled. The Hebrew scriptures are scriptures that produce a longing in the heart that knows them. If you know how to read your Bible and you read these stories, oh my goodness, you either are filled up with hope or you're filled up with despair. Because it seems as though God doesn't keep any of his promises. But we know God keeps his word. What's going on here? And for 400 years, we don't get prophets. There are stories to tell. For a very brief time, the people of God are independent. They suffer when they get back under harassment, and then they suffer under Greek rule, and then for a brief period of time, the Maccabees, the hammer, they come and free the people, but it can't last. And here come the Romans, and who can beat the Romans? As this story comes to a close, the people of God aren't even their own kingdom anymore. The people who will end up reigning over them are people appointed by their enemies to be their kings. What has become of the promises, especially the promise that God made to David? And then comes the gospel. You see, if you know your Old Testament, then you can really understand your New Testament. All of it is fulfilled by Jesus. Every single one of those longings, those promises, those hopes, they don't have their realization until Jesus the Christ takes the stage. And when it seems like everything has gone wrong and bad and they can't possibly be made right, here comes the king. The king who doesn't look like any king that's ever been, because he's a Deuteronomy 17 king. He reigns by the will of God, not by the power and force of armies and money and treaties. He doesn't do any of that. In fact, he never even seemed to care about them at all. He just loved people. And he led them to pay attention to God. And then he died. And then he was raised from the dead. And as the resurrected king, he's the only one qualified to fulfill the promise made to David so long ago that his kingdom and his throne would be established forever. And where is he right now? At the right hand of God, ruling over the nations. That's our gospel. That's good news. I suppose if you're his enemy, well, if you look at Psalm 2, that can be something of a disaster. It can really be a problem. But here's the thing. He doesn't want any enemies. That's not who he is. You see in the stories in the gospel a man who just wants to love everybody. And it doesn't matter whether you're good or bad. It doesn't matter whether you're a prostitute or a religious prig. He doesn't care. He'll go into every home and he'll eat with everybody. And he cares about everyone. And he died. He died for our sins. For everyone. And now he reigns over anyone who will have him. Now, when he becomes king, his way of life is pretty hard. And he has pretty high expectations. But he helps. Like it was promised through Ezekiel, that heart of stone comes out. The Spirit is within us. to make us able to obey the King. Isn't this story great? It's so good. Why would anyone not want to know this? This is the epic story of our great Redeemer God. And here's the wonder of it all. He does all this so that he can reign, but Jesus is not at all selfish about the way that he reigns. No. No, in the book of Revelation, we have the promise that we will reign with him. And what's that about? Well, why did God create humanity in the first place? To have dominion over his creation. See, what Jesus has done is to reestablish God's intended purpose for humanity. He's a human king himself, but it's not just him. It's everybody that he's connected to. Because we become safe to reign. We become like him. So we won't use our authority for our own selfish ends. No. We'll reign the way he reigns. We'll exercise dominion the way that he does. Lifting up all of creation. Blessing all of it. Folks, I'm telling you, this is a good story. If it's not one you're familiar with, if you haven't read this, well, I just gave you the Cliff Notes. The book's better. Give it a read. God gave us this wondrous story to fill us with wonder and awe. And he did all this so that we would have a story worth talking about a God worth talking about. Because he wants his fallen creation back. He's not satisfied with the disruption in our reign. He wants to reestablish what he always intended. And it's his plan to get it back. And that's why God sent Jesus. And Jesus sent us for the honor of Christ and for the life of the world. There's hope for the Messiah. Ouch.